She never flinched when the little boy ducked beneath the counter, but everyone else in the diner did. Coffee cups rattled as the front door burst open beneath the force of the storm, carrying with it cold rain, muddy footprints, and the commanding voice of a man dressed too well for a highway cafe at 2 in the morning. He scanned the room once before pointing toward the frightened child hiding beside the shelves. His words were calm enough to fool anyone who wanted the night to end quickly. He said the boy had wandered away. He said he was family. He said there had been a misunderstanding. Most people would have believed him. Elena did not. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the nearly empty diner while bacon grease crackled on the grill behind her. Outside, sheets of rain blurred the parking lot into shifting shadows where 18-wheelers slept beneath yellow lamps. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with wet asphalt drifted through the cracked doorway every time the wind pushed against it. Elena had worked the overnight shift for almost 4 years, and she had learned that the darkness carried its own language. Some people arrived tired. Some arrived lonely. Some arrived broken. And then there were those who entered carrying silence that felt heavier than words. The boy belonged to the last group. His sneakers were soaked, but his jacket remained strangely dry beneath the hood as though someone had carefully protected him from the rain until only moments before. Tiny scratches marked his hands. One sleeve had been stitched by hand using dark blue thread that did not match the rest of the fabric. His breathing was controlled, almost practiced, even though his eyes were wide with fear. Children usually cried. This one counted. His lips barely moved as he whispered numbers beneath every breath. Elena noticed before anyone else. The businessman noticed Elena noticing him. He smiled politely at the sheriff's deputy finishing a late meal near the window. His expensive watch reflected the ceiling lights while his polished shoes remained spotless despite the mud outside. Everything about him seemed perfect except his eyes. They never searched for the child. They searched for exits. Deputy Harris stood slowly, adjusting the heavy belt around his waist. He knew the businessman by name. Everyone in the county did. Victor Hale donated to schools, sponsored youth sports, and appeared smiling in newspaper photographs beside local officials. He shook hands confidently and remembered birthdays. People trusted him because they wanted to believe successful men earned success honestly. Harris looked toward Elena with an apologetic shrug, already expecting the situation to resolve itself. Elena reached beneath the counter, pretending to organize coffee filters while quietly pressing the silent alarm connected to the sheriff's office. Hardly anyone knew it existed. The previous owner had installed it after a string of robberies years earlier. She had never needed to touch it before tonight. The child watched her hand disappear beneath the counter. His counting stopped. For the first time since entering the diner, he looked directly into her eyes. There was no panic in his expression. Only recognition. Victor stepped closer with reassuring confidence. He thanked everyone for their patience and explained that the boy had experienced emotional difficulties since losing relatives in an accident. His voice carried warmth polished through years of public speaking. Every sentence landed exactly where it should. Sympathy filled the room like rising steam. Elena continued pouring coffee into an untouched mug. She noticed Victor never once spoke the boy's name. Not once. Instead, he used words like son, family, and responsibility. Careful words. Safe words. The deputy crouched beside the counter. He smiled gently toward the child. Come on, buddy. Let's get you home. The boy pressed himself farther against the shelves without making a sound. Elena finally spoke. Her voice remained quiet enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. If he's family, what's his middle name? Victor answered without hesitation. Alexander. The boy closed his eyes. Elena noticed the smallest movement of his head. Not a nod. Not a shake. Just disappointment. She looked toward the deputy. Ask him what game they played on his birthday. Victor laughed politely. Deputy Harris smiled awkwardly. Elena, I think that's enough. She wiped the counter slowly. Maybe.
But people remember birthdays. Especially children.
Victor's smile faded almost invisibly.
The storm outside grew louder.
Somewhere beyond the parking lot, thunder rolled across the hills like distant machinery. The diner suddenly felt much smaller than before.
Victor's attention shifted completely toward Elena.
He studied the way she watched reflections instead of faces. He noticed how she positioned herself so every entrance remained within sight. He saw that she never allowed anyone to stand behind her without turning slightly first.
Those were not habits learned serving coffee. Those belonged somewhere else. Somewhere darker. He stepped closer until only the counter separated them.
His voice remained controlled, but irritation slipped beneath each carefully chosen word.
Where did you learn that? The room became still. Even the sizzling grill seemed quieter.
Elena rested the coffee pot on its burner without taking her eyes from the rain-covered windows. Her reflection stared back through the glass while another shape lingered beyond it for only a heartbeat before disappearing into darkness between the trees. She had seen movement no one else noticed. Very softly, almost as though speaking to herself, she answered.
Night Stalkers don't quit. The words meant nothing to anyone else inside the diner.
But the little boy's face changed instantly. Relief replaced fear. Victor's jaw tightened for the first time that night.
Deputy Harris frowned in confusion.
Before anyone could ask another question, every light inside the diner flickered.
Once. Twice.
Then the parking lot went completely dark. The backup generator failed to start. The storm swallowed the building in blackness so complete that only lightning revealed the outlines of terrified faces. For one brilliant flash, Elena saw 3 figures standing motionless at the edge of the forest beyond the highway, watching the diner without moving. When the darkness returned, they were gone, but one thing remained certain. They had never come for the boy alone.
And somehow, they already knew exactly where she was.
The deputy's flashlight carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, but every sweep across the parking lot only made the shadows appear deeper. Rain hammered the roof with relentless rhythm while the emergency lights above the kitchen cast a dim crimson glow over frightened faces. Nobody spoke at first. The silence felt unnatural, as though the storm itself had paused to listen. Elena kept her eyes on the windows, not because she expected to see someone standing there, but because she knew experienced hunters rarely stayed where they had already been seen. The little boy remained beneath the counter, knees pulled tightly against his chest, his breathing steady again as if the whispered phrase had convinced him that, for the first time in a long while, someone understood exactly what was happening. Deputy Harris reached for his radio, but only static answered him. The nearest patrol unit was miles away, and the mountains often swallowed radio signals during heavy weather. Victor Hale took a slow breath before speaking with remarkable composure. He insisted that everyone remain calm, yet his confidence had begun to fracture around the edges. Tiny beads of sweat gathered near his temple despite the cold air.
Elena noticed something else.
His eyes no longer searched for the child. They searched the darkness outside, almost expecting someone to arrive.
That single observation shifted the balance of the entire night. Fear had entered the room, but it was not fear of the police. It was fear of someone else. Elena quietly walked toward the front entrance and locked the deadbolt before lowering the metal security shutter halfway across the glass. Nobody questioned her.
Something in her movements carried the certainty of long practice. She checked every window, every emergency exit, every blind corner inside the diner with calm precision. Deputy Harris watched her carefully before asking the question that had been growing inside him since she whispered those strange words.
How do you know what they're going to do? Elena did not answer immediately.
Instead, she picked up a sugar packet from a nearby table and placed it near the center of the room. Then she moved several coffee mugs around it. They don't rush into the middle, she said quietly. They pressure the edges. They wait until people start making emotional decisions. Then they choose the weakest point. Harris looked around the diner as though seeing it for the first time. Victor's expression became impossible to hide. He recognized the accuracy of every word she had spoken. The boy slowly emerged from beneath the counter and walked directly toward Elena.
Without hesitation, he reached into his jacket and placed a folded piece of paper in her hand. It was soaked but still readable. Inside was a crude drawing made with blue pencil. Most people would have seen only random lines. Elena saw a map.
More importantly, she saw 3 symbols she had not encountered in nearly 9 years. Her heartbeat stumbled for the first time that evening.
She folded the paper before anyone else could study it.
Harris noticed her reaction.
"What is it?" he asked.
Elena stared toward the rain-covered windows.
"They're not following him. They were following this." Victor finally spoke with complete honesty.
His polished public voice disappeared. "I tried to get him away before they realized he'd escaped."
The confession landed heavily inside the silent diner.
Harris turned sharply toward him.
"Escaped from who?"
Victor lowered his eyes.
"From people who don't leave witnesses." The room grew still once more. Elena had expected many answers. That was not one of them.
Victor explained that nearly a year earlier he had secretly funded investigations into a trafficking organization operating across several states. The criminals hid behind legitimate businesses, charity foundations, and transport companies. Every time authorities closed one route, another appeared somewhere else. The organization became known among investigators by a name few officers ever spoke aloud because the survivors always whispered it the same way.
Night Stalkers.
Elena closed her eyes for only a moment. The name carried memories she had buried beneath years of ordinary life.
Long roads walked alone. Locked rooms without windows.
Learning which floorboards creaked and which remained silent.
Counting footsteps instead of sheep before sleeping. Remembering faces instead of names because names could be taken away.
She had escaped when she was 19, but escaping had never truly meant freedom.
It only meant distance.
She had changed cities, changed jobs, even changed her surname, believing anonymity could become a second chance. She never imagined the past would arrive wearing polished shoes and carrying frightened children. Harris stared at her.
"You know them." Elena answered with barely more than a whisper. "I survived them." Nobody spoke after that.
Even the storm seemed quieter.
The diner settled into a deep, uneasy silence broken only by the ticking wall clock. Every second sounded louder than the last. Elena slowly walked toward the back storage door.
She knelt beside the threshold and brushed her fingertips across the wet concrete just outside.
Fresh mud.
A tiny black thread caught beneath the metal frame. And beside it, carved so carefully that almost nobody would have noticed, was a small crescent-shaped mark no larger than a coin.
Her breathing stopped. She did not call anyone over. She simply stared.
That symbol had once been left outside safe houses before raids.
It was never a threat. It was a promise. "We found you."
Behind her, nobody moved.
Harris watched in confusion.
Victor remained frozen beside the counter. The little boy looked at the mark and quietly began counting again.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Elena closed her hand over the carved symbol without another word. The silence stretched painfully across the room.
No thunder. No dishes. No footsteps. Only breathing.
Then, from somewhere above the ceiling, came the slow creak of weight pressing against the roof.
One step. Then another. Everyone looked upward together. Rain continued falling, yet beneath it another sound emerged.
Careful footsteps moving with impossible patience.
Not one person. Several.
Elena slowly raised a finger to her lips, warning everyone to remain absolutely silent. She switched off the emergency lights, allowing darkness to swallow the diner once more.
Nobody argued. Nobody even breathed loudly.
The footsteps stopped.
For several endless seconds nothing happened.
Then a child's voice drifted faintly through the rain from outside the front door.
It sounded frightened. It sounded alone.
It sounded exactly like the boy standing safely beside Elena.
Harris instinctively reached toward the entrance, but Elena caught his wrist before he could move. Her grip was firm without being forceful.
"That's not him," she whispered. "They use echoes." The deputy felt the blood drain from his face. Another voice followed, this time calling Victor's name in perfect imitation of his late wife's voice. Victor staggered backward, horror replacing every trace of confidence.
Elena realized the hunters had learned something new since she escaped. They no longer relied only on force.
They had learned patience.
They had learned memory.
And as another deliberate footstep crossed the roof above them, she understood the most terrifying truth of all.
The people surrounding the diner were not searching for the boy anymore.
They had recognized her, and after 9 years of waiting, the Night Stalkers had finally come to finish the hunt. She opened the back door before anyone could stop her, stepping into the cold rain with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that fear only grew stronger behind locked walls. Water streamed from the diner roof in silver sheets, soaking her jacket within seconds, yet she never looked down.
Every instinct she had fought to forget returned with unsettling clarity. The angle of the wind. The distance between the trees. The faint impression of boots pressed into soft mud.
Somewhere beyond the darkness, someone was watching and waiting for her first mistake. Deputy Harris started after her, but she lifted one hand without turning around. He stopped. There was something in her posture that told him she had crossed into a world he did not understand. Victor stood beside the frightened boy, his face heavy with guilt. For years he had believed he was protecting children by exposing criminals through paperwork, investigations, and confidential meetings.
He now understood that the woman serving coffee through quiet nights had survived battles far more personal than any report could ever describe. Elena walked slowly across the empty parking lot until she reached the edge of the forest.
Rain tapped gently against the leaves overhead while distant thunder rolled across the hills. She knelt beside a shallow puddle and brushed away a layer of wet pine needles. Beneath them lay another crescent symbol carved into a flat stone. It was fresh. Someone had placed it there only minutes earlier. She closed her eyes, remembering another rainy night many years before when an older survivor had whispered the first rule that kept frightened children alive.
Hunters chase footsteps.
Guardians leave choices. That single sentence had stayed with her longer than any scar. Behind her, the little boy suddenly called her name. It was the first time anyone had heard his voice all night. He held up the folded drawing again, this time pointing toward a cluster of lines near one corner that Elena had overlooked.
It was not simply a map. It showed an abandoned fire lookout tower less than a mile into the forest.
Victor stepped closer.
During the investigation, we believe they used that tower as a relay point years ago. We never found enough evidence. Elena studied the drawing once more before something finally became clear. The tower was never their destination. It was bait. Every escape route on the map pointed away from it. They wanted pursuers to focus on the tower while the real movement happened elsewhere. She smiled faintly despite the danger. They were counting on everyone to think like police officers. Tonight they would have to think like survivors instead. She quietly instructed Harris to take the boy through the old service tunnel beneath the diner that led toward an abandoned maintenance shed across the highway, a passage almost nobody remembered because it had been sealed decades earlier after flooding. The elderly owner had once shown it to Elena while telling stories about the building's history. The detail she had tucked away years earlier now became the difference between life and death. Victor insisted on staying behind, believing the hunters wanted him as much as Elena. She nodded. For the first time that night they shared complete trust without another explanation. Together they walked toward the tree line, making just enough noise to be followed. Branches snapped deliberately beneath their feet. Flashlights remained switched off. Rain concealed every other sound. Somewhere behind them, movement answered. One shadow became 3. 3 became 5. The hunters were closing in exactly as Elena expected. She and Victor reached the abandoned lookout tower just before dawn began to soften the eastern horizon. The structure leaned dangerously with age, its wooden stairs cracked by decades of neglect. A lone figure stepped from beneath the tower without raising a weapon.
He was older than Elena expected, dressed in ordinary clothes that revealed nothing remarkable. That was precisely what made him dangerous.
Monsters rarely looked like monsters.
They looked forgettable. His voice carried neither anger nor triumph.
Only disappointment.
"You could have disappeared forever," he said softly.
"Instead, you chose to become visible again." Elena looked steadily into his eyes. "I never became visible. You finally ran out of places to hide from the truth."
For a brief moment, nobody moved. Even the rain seemed to hesitate. Then dozens of flashing lights burst through the forest behind the hunters.
Patrol vehicles. State investigators. Federal agents.
Victor stared in disbelief. Elena had pressed the silent alarm hours earlier, but it had done more than notify the local sheriff. Years before, after giving confidential testimony under another identity, she had insisted that any activation connected to her employment be quietly routed to a federal task force if communications ever failed. It was a precaution she hoped would never matter.
Tonight it mattered.
The hunters turned to flee, but every escape path they had carefully planned was already surrounded. They had spent years believing they controlled every exit. They never imagined someone who understood their methods better than they did would quietly redraw the map. Arrests happened quickly, almost without violence. The older man never resisted. As officers placed handcuffs around his wrists, he looked once more toward Elena.
"I taught you everything you know,"
she answered with gentle certainty.
"No. You taught me everything I refused to become."
Those words lingered in the morning air long after he lowered his eyes. The little boy emerged safely from the maintenance trail with Deputy Harris, wrapped in a blanket and holding a warm cup of cocoa someone had found in the patrol vehicles. For the first time, he smiled without fear. Victor knelt beside him, tears mixing with rain, relieved that promises he had nearly failed to keep had finally been honored. Weeks later, the diner reopened with repaired windows and fresh paint. Travelers stopped for coffee without ever realizing the quiet building had once stood at the center of a night that ended an organization responsible for countless stolen lives. Newspapers praised investigators, celebrated arrests, and printed photographs of officials shaking hands beneath bright cameras.
Elena's name appeared nowhere.
That was exactly how she wanted it. She returned to pouring coffee before sunrise, greeting weary strangers with the same calm kindness she had always offered. Sometimes the strongest people leave no monument behind them, only safer mornings for those who will never know their names. The little boy, now living with a loving foster family, visited every few months. He no longer counted beneath his breath. Instead, he laughed loudly enough to fill the entire diner. Whenever he asked why she had risked everything for someone she had never met, Elena would simply smile toward the first light spreading across the highway and say that darkness survives by convincing people to look away. Dawn begins with the first person who refuses. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle hidden inside ordinary lives. The greatest acts of courage are often witnessed by almost no one, yet they change the future of people they will never meet. If this story stayed with you after the final sunrise, carry its light forward by sharing it with someone who may need the reminder that even the longest night cannot outlast a heart that chooses compassion over fear.